Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're continuing our coverage of the 1971 Candidates tournament between Petrosian and Bobby Fischer. Petrosian, the heavy favorite in this tournament. Up until this point in game number 6, both sides are tied from points. Bobby Fischer came out one game 1, Petrosian won game 2, and there's been 3 draws since then. Now, Petrosian does have the white pieces in game number 6, so he's going to be looking to take the advantage going into game number 7. He starts out with knight to f3. We don't see too much of the ready opening, but that is what we have here. c5, pawn to b3, d5, bishop to b2, and then f6, which may look like an interesting move since most people are going to recommend not playing f6, myself included. This is one of those rare openings where you will see f6. White is not trying to control the center of the board with his pawns right now. And so Bobby Fischer says, I'm going to do everything I can in my power to control with the pawns. You can start to see with the c5, d5. Now f6 is going to prepare the way for e5 without needing the knight. So many times the knight will come to c6. You could get your bishop involved into the game to protect this pawn, but he wants to push forward with e5 even before he gets his knight involved into the game. So this is that rare case where we're going to see that f6, but this does weaken the king side of the board. It also does not allow Bobby Fischer in the future to play knight to f6, which is a pretty common move for black early on, especially if you're going to be castling on the king side. So Bobby Fischer needs to really put a lot of pressure, push his pawns as far down white side of the board as he can, and really try to just strangle and keep white from really developing his board. If Petrosian can develop his board state, he's going to have a better endgame just as far as the pawn structure, as far as the weakened king side of the board from Bobby Fischer. Just need to make sure he can develop his pieces, get everything involved into the action. We see a c4 and then d4, exactly what Bobby Fischer's looking to do here. Stop a lot of the squares that white can control. This dark square bishop here on b2 is not doing anything, being blocked off from the pawn here on d4. Pawn d3 does allow, if the bishop ever wants to come down to c1, can swing over to the king side of the board here. But all in all, this really just blocks off these light square bishops. So maybe eventually the light square bishop can come here to g2. But all in all, Bobby Fischer doing exactly what he wants to do, because after e5, you can see he just has a lot more pressure on this center of the board. Now, if we come back and say, what other options did Petrosian have here? He didn't have to push with his pawn here. He could have played something like c3, knight to c3, that is, attacking the pawn. Maybe now the pawn comes down to d4, attacking the knight. Knight to e4. We could see pawn down here to e5. Same moves from Bobby Fischer. One slight difference is now we see e3. Instead of having moved either the c or the d pawn, now this is immediately threatening this center of the board from Bobby Fischer. His dark square bishop here is attacking the center of the board. He can get his light square bishop involved into the board very easily, and he has 2 knights that are very active in the board. You can see how different that is than if we come back and see after e5 here, this light square bishop cannot get involved into the game. This dark square bishop is not doing too much. This knight is on b1. It's not very active. So slight difference I think Petrosian could have taken and not played that c4 move early on. But in the game, that's exactly what happened. Now he plays e3. This does start to attack the center of the board from Bobby Fischer. Also opens up for his light square bishop to come here to e2 and castle on the king side whenever he's ready to do that. Bobby Fischer continues with knight to e7. I think knight to c6 is fine as well, putting another defender on the square. He already has 2 pawns and his queen, but a pretty common development move from black here. Decides to play knight to e7, bishop to e2, knight to c6. So really wants to get this knight out of the way for the dark square bishop to get involved into the action, but doesn't want to move his knight here on b8, which is a little surprising because he could have just come here to c6 in the first place. But knight to d2 here, bishop e7, castle on the king side, and castle on the king side as well. And then pawn to e4. So Petrosian seems to be okay solidifying the pawn chain right here. knowing that Bobby Fischer definitely has a lot more pressure since his pawn has come down to this 4th rank. That's when you can tell you're in your opponent's territory. You can see Petrosian does not have that. Also has a backward pawn here on d3 that Bobby Fischer eventually, if he can get past these enemy lines here, can start to attack here. Now we have a6, knight back here to e1, recognizing there's not much going on the king side of the board. Very difficult to get a lot of action here. This pawn on f6 does stop a lot of the threats as far as the squares that white would want to go to. This light square bishop is also stopping a lot of the squares that white might go to as well. So Petrosian looks at this and says, I'm going to bring my knight back here to e1, maybe get involved on the queen side of the board, which is exactly where Bobby Fischer looks to be aiming his pieces. Plays pawn to b5, just trying to blow up this queen side of the board as well. Bishop to g4, says, yeah, I'll go ahead and exchange material right here. And then queen to c7, or excuse me, queen to c8, which I thought was interesting from Bobby Fischer, saying, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give up my queen if you want to. Feeling that confident in his pawn structure and the setup that he has. Petrosian's having none of it, brings the queen back here to e2. And then knight to d7, knight here to c2. Rook to b8, just putting pressure on this b file, looking to eventually exchange here. Rook over here to a c1, queen e8. A bishop here to a3. Wasn't doing anything on b2. We saw that it was blocked off. And this is just saying, okay, this pawn is a little less defended than this pawn here on d4. So decides to go ahead and bring it here to start to attack that. Bishop to d6, opening up for the queen to just control the square here on e5. Knight back here to e1. Just couldn't find any ground for it to go to. But you can see from Bobby Fischer's standpoint, his pawns are doing a good job of locking off so many of these squares that white really wants to go to. Then we have g6, so stopping even more squares that white could go to. It's really difficult to figure out how white's going to continue as far as his development plan. Does decide to go ahead and take here on b5. We see the exchange back, then the bishop comes back here to b2. Knight to b6 here, knight up here to f3, rook to a8, so we do have a semi-open file. The rook here on c1 for white's attacking this, but then from Bobby Fischer's standpoint, he is attacking the a file here as well with his rook. a3, and then we have the knight coming here to a5, attacking this pawn. You always want to look at the material that's left behind. This pawn is defending this pawn here on b3. As soon as it moved, Bobby Fischer immediately brings his knight here to a5, attacking this pawn here on b3, which currently is only defended by the knight on d2. So Petrosian brings his queen back here to d2. Does not want to have his knight here on d2 hanging out. Wants to be able to develop it as needed. So he has to have a piece come back and defend this pawn here on b3. Now we have queen to f7, and this is preparing for pawn c4. You can see this knight right here, all of those pieces eyeing up on this c4 square, very important. So the queen comes down here to f7 to prepare for that push as well. We have a4 to stop the immediate push, so pawn takes here. Pawn recaptures here on a4. Now white does have a pass pawn, going to be looking to push that as much as possible. And then c4, the push that we talked about. And then after the take right here, we do see have the pawn here on d4. This is a pass pawn that Bobby Fischer is also going to be looking to push as much as possible. Knight takes, we do see in exchange in the center of the board, and then queen to e2. Knight takes here on b2, so quite a bit of material coming off the board. Queen takes on a b2. Rook to b8, forcing the queen to move. Comes to a2, really forcing Bobby Fischer to make a decision here. If he wants to go ahead and take it with his queen, he's going to have to do something because he can't move his queen because it's being pinned down by this queen to his king here. He decides to go ahead and do an in-between move of bishop to b4, and then the queen takes and the king recaptures right here. Rook comes up here to c7, check, and the king comes to e6. Now, in the game, Petrosian decides to play g4. He did have the option if he wanted to take with his rook here on h7. He takes this pawn, but black's going to be able to get that pawn back. He could play bishop to c3, And you can't just play rook to a2 trying to hold on to this material. You can see the rook is attacking the pawn here on a4. Can't do that because rook down here to b1. This would eventually be checkmate. This is a back rake mate. There's no way for white to stop this. He could play knight to e1 to drag it out one more move, but you can see there's no place for this king to go. So instead, the rook's not going to come to a2. That would be a terrible move. He could play rook to c1, attacking the bishop, getting out of harm's way. But you can see this is a nice little outpost that Bobby Fischer has, but then the rook can just come down, taking on a4. So Petrosian, knowing he can't take that material freely, decides a different path, decides instead to go pawn to g4. Now you could see after bishop to c3, it's completely fine if the rook were to come up to a2. Not necessarily saying that he's going to, but now if the rook were to come down to b1, then the king can come to g2 freely. It's not going to be that back rank mate. Pretty difficult to say if you tried over and over again. So after the bishop does come back to c3, then we are going to see rook to a2, rook to c8, and then we do have an exchange right here. But that just frees up Petrosian to start pushing his pawn up the board here. Rook to a8, but that's not stopping Petrosian. Pawn to a6. Rook to a7 says, yeah, I don't want you to push that any further up the board here. So it does play rook to a7. And then king to f1, trying to get that involved into the action. Pawn to g5 on the king side of the board. King to e2. King here to d6. Now, if you look at both sides, it stands that black has a better position. Yes, white has a passed pawn, but so does black here on d4. But this bishop's going to be able to cover more ground, knowing that there's a pawn over here on the queen side, as well as pawn structures over here on the king side as well. The bishop just does a better job of controlling more of the board state, where the knight, it does better if there's just pawns on one side of the board. It can really focus on attacking a lot of the critical squares, but right now the bishop's going to be able to fly around, especially with rooks on the board. It just does better fighting alongside a rook. So then the king's going to come to d3. King to c5 here. You can see the work that this outpost on d4 is doing here for black. Knight back here to g1, trying to find a good square that the knight can go to. Has to come back to g1 before it can come here to e2 here. King b5, and then knight here to e2. And this is the next move that I think is just shows the brilliance of Bobby Fischer, because I think so many people are going to see this and say, okay, the king is here. The rook can freely take here. It's going to go up a pawn in material. This is why the king has come over here, but it actually doesn't work quite like that. After the rook takes, then the rook can take here on a6. The king takes, but then the knight takes, and you can see now that although it's an outpost, then this king's going to take here, and this is going to be a drawn game. There's no way for either side to advance past and actually do any damage here. So if we come back here, Bobby Fischer looks at this and says, yeah, I'm not going to take with my rook here. Instead, I'm going to play bishop to a5. And now how does white really continue from here? He decides, sure, go ahead and check with this rook here on b2, but the king can freely take on a6. And that is such a brilliant move, because I think it is very difficult to find to set this up so that your rook stops it, your bishop defends it, and then your king can go ahead and take it here on a6. So now we have the rook come back here to b1, rook to c7, rook to b1 or b2, bishop down here to e1, attacking this pawn on f2. Pawn comes up here to f3, king a5, rook c2. Says, yeah, if you want to exchange, we definitely can here. Bobby Fischer not looking to do that. Wants to be using his rook on the board. Yes, he has a pawn advantage, but he also recognizes that his opponent right now has central control. His king over here on a5 is not really in the place that he wants it to be, so has to get that in a better position if he ever wants to exchange these rooks on the board. Rook to a2, check. King comes back. We do see another check. Now the bishop comes in and defends the king a little bit with bishop to b4. Rook a2, rook c7, controlling the file again. Rook to a1. You can see both sides just moving back and forth, not really doing any damage here. We do see the rook come down here to d5, outpost move, checking the king here, but pretty easy to stop that with bishop here to c5. King comes back here to a4, then rook to d7. Always attacking this pawn, but as soon as he takes it, you just get a sense that he's just no longer involved into the game here. Bishop to b4, and then knight to e2. King down to b3. Rook to b7 says, yeah, I want to stop the bishop from moving here. That's completely fine. Can get the rook involved into the game with rook to a8 here. And then the rook takes on h7. But again, what really happens here? He could try something like knight takes here on d4. Yes, he is giving up a knight here for a pawn here. But then he could take his pawn here on h7. He does get 2 pawns in exchange for that knight and could just try to make something of this. It's just very difficult to see exactly how white's going to continue. But he decides to take with his rook here on h7. But then rook down to a1. Man, it's so tough to stop the rook to d1. Because you can see that's checkmate. There's just no good way for white to get out of this. His rook is completely out of the game now. So it is up to this knight to stop this. Decides now he has to now take material on d4. Or is just going to lose the game or give up his knight for nothing. So the pawn takes. The king takes here. So gives up his knight for 2 pawns. But then rook to d1. King comes back here to e3. You can see after a few moves, it's just so difficult to hold on to the game here. So after a few more moves, eventually we do see Petrosian decide to go ahead and resign in this position. There's just no way to stop it. The bishop's doing a good job of stopping some of the moves the white king can come to. Rook to h1 eventually would be checkmate. So Petrosian decides, although I had the white pieces, and it's definitely not what I wanted, I need to resign to Bobby Fischer in game number 6. So Bobby Fischer has got to be feeling pretty good going into games number 7. He'll have the white pieces and also a game lead. You can start to see momentum shifting into Bobby Fischer's favor. But that is game number 6 of the 1971 Canada's tournament. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time in game number 7.